I had a green light, so I did it quick.
Oh, yeah.
Last-
Good evening and welcome to the South Haven Planning Commission Workshop for Thursday, August 8th, 2024. I'm going to call the workshop to order. And we're going to review the master plan update and then it's a housing session.
Thank you. Ryan Kilpatrick from Flywheel is with us tonight to discuss housing in South Haven. Ryan is a familiar face to many of you, if not most of you who are here tonight. He's given a couple of workshops in South Haven over the past couple of years, and his group prepared a housing analysis for the city last year. So some of the recommendations from that study were the basis for the housing-related questions that were asked on the community survey that was put together for our master plan and which closed earlier this summer. So as the chairman mentioned, this is officially a master plan workshop, and we're hoping to use Ryan's time with us tonight to dig a little deeper into some of the housing strategies or typologies that could be employed here in South Haven to increase our available stock, with the end goal being to include some language in the master plan that supports efforts to increase housing in our community. So with that, I will turn it over.
I'm going to stand if that's okay. I drove down.
Or you can sit over there if you want.
I might sit later. I've been in the car a lot today, so
Okay.
it's nice to be able to stand for a minute. So thanks, Kelly. Thanks for hosting me again. For any of you who have attended the recent council workshops that we've done over the last couple of years, there will be some familiar content here, some new, more detailed content as it relates to building typologies and how to plan and code for those. But my expectation is we'll get through the presentation format of this in about 30 to 40 minutes. Feel free to interrupt me at any point if you want to talk through anything, if you want to question any of the data, if you want to talk about terminology. All of that is fair game and open to dialogue. The intent here tonight, I think, is to make sure that you all feel like you have a shared understanding of the problems you're trying to solve, of how you want to talk about those issues together, and what some of the opportunities are relative to market dynamics, right? So we're going to really try to understand this in the context of what does it cost to build, what does it cost to buy in South Haven, how do we actually provide additional types of housing and additional price points without having to subsidize everything. But we can also talk about what are the subsidies that are available. That's going to be a little bit outside of the scope of the Planning Commission generally, but it can be helpful to know, if you're going to plan or zone for a particular type of housing, what are the subsidies that are available for that type? So with that, we'll dive into some of this content, and again, interrupt me as often as you like.
You guys need to move over here so you can see.
Yeah, I see it.
Good.
I think I'll be okay with that. Feel free to scooch around. I start with this slide because I want to acknowledge when we get into conversations about housing, especially in today's market when things are so expensive, it often feels like we're driving towards kind of the lowest common denominator because we're trying to strip out cost and make things as efficient and as affordable as possible. And I always want to start with this foundational premise that we're trying to build neighborhoods and communities, places that people want to live, that they want to raise their kids, that they want to retire in. And so we don't want to sacrifice those things that build high quality neighborhoods where people can interact with one another, feel like they have a sense of place and a sense of belonging. Those are really core to the process of creating community. And so at any point when we get to the point where you start to feel like, boy, we're really stripping out all the value here just to save on cost, I want you to flag those kinds of things, both with me and kind of in your own process to make sure that you're getting the type of neighborhood development that will endure for generations. Go ahead to the next slide, Kelly. So in addition to housing being important socially, right, for a long time we thought about housing and affordability as a social service or a social good. It's important for all of the people that live in the community. It's also important from an economic development perspective, and our businesses are increasingly recognizing this. Up until 2015 or so, there tended to be a pretty strong separation between the business community and the housing advocacy community. Businesses felt like, it's not our job to provide housing for our employees, right? The government can figure that out, or nonprofits can figure that out. But then beginning around 2015, and then even more significantly in 2020 during kind of the severe epidemic of the COVID crisis, what we found was employers saying, we can't get people to come to work, either because the time it took to commute to the job was so significant, and their employees had the ability to work from home, and so getting them to actually come to work became difficult. Or it was simply because there wasn't anything within close proximity that was affordable. And so even if they were willing to drive 45 minutes into work, they still couldn't find something that they could afford. And so part of this conversation is really about how do we continue to grow and sustain our local businesses, our manufacturers, our public education system, our local government. All rely on employees that tend to be earning in the $40,000 to $90,000 a year range. And in South Haven in particular, many of those workers, if they don't already own a home, getting into the housing market in locations like South Haven can be really difficult. Go ahead, next slide. So just to illustrate that, we pulled the data from the United States Department of Labor Statistics. This is for Michigan, and particularly in Van Buren County. What I'm going to show you is the average wage for these positions. And for this one, the average wage is for a teacher that's been in the industry for 15 years and has a bachelor's degree. So average wage right now is about $61,000 a year for a teacher that's been teaching for 10 to 15 years. And so that means she can afford a monthly housing budget of about $1,500 a month. Now, if she's going to buy a home and it's just her income or his income, the purchase has to include the cost of taxes and insurance, right? When the bank underwrites your mortgage, it's going to include taxes and insurance. So that $1,500 a month housing budget allows them to afford a home that's probably priced in the $225,000 to $275,000 price range. But based on current interest rates and a home sale price average in South Haven that is about $400,000, the actual cost to buy a home in South Haven right now is closer to $3,000 a month. And that assumes a 95% mortgage at 6.5% interest, which would be kind of the most flexible terms you could get in today's market. So you can see there's a gap, right? If you're a teacher working full-time with a lot of experience, if you're single, if you don't have a partner whose income you can also rely on, buying a home in South Haven is probably out of the question. Go ahead, next slide. Now, also, we rely on a number of services and professionals in our community just to keep the community running, right? Not just emergency medical technicians, but our Department of Public Works. Mary, did you have a question?
Sorry. Do you have income for incoming teachers?
Oh, for like first year and second year?
And the reason I ask is we are losing teachers that have 1 to 3 years experience. They are going elsewhere where the cost of living is less.
Yeah. The last I looked, and this isn't updated, the last I looked, it was in the $40,000 to $50,000 range if you're a first-year teacher trying to come into the market.
Because at city council, it was indicated that it was about, I think, 38.
Okay.
So
Yeah, and if you've looked more recently than I have, that might be more
I haven't
accurate.
looked, that's just what they said. And for South Haven, all of our emergency medical, our EMS, they're cross-trained for fire, so they tend to
Okay.
make a higher wage.
Great.
And in fact, I think that they have openings posted. They have,
Okay, so we could
Yeah.
find out exactly what the price
yeah, I
range
think
is.
I thought it was like 50,000.
Great. Yeah, that's great. Well, so in a minute, we're going to talk about what do we mean when we say affordable. And there will be a slide to that. But essentially what we mean is if your income is X, whether it's $38,000 or $50,000, we just take 30% of that annual gross income and divide it by 12. And that's your monthly housing budget. That's kind of the general rule of thumb is if you're spending more than 30% of your gross income, you're probably going to be sacrificing something in your budget. It means you're not putting away any savings for retirement or education, or if your car breaks down. And with inflation, what we're seeing is higher cost of groceries, higher cost of gas, all of those things add up. And so if you're spending more than 30% of your income on housing, you tend to be in a much more tenuous housing situation, right? One catastrophe, and it's either the credit card or eviction, right? And we don't want a lot of residents in that position. So $50,000 a year would be better, but probably what a $50,000 a year salary for a firefighter EMT would allow you to afford is closer to an $1,100 a month rent rate, which is still a bit below the median rental rate in South Haven. And of course, in South Haven, there aren't a lot of rental units that are available year-round, right? There are some multifamily properties and then some single-family homes that rent, but there's a fairly high homeownership rate for both year-round and seasonal homeowners, which kind of squeezes out the rest of the rental community. Go ahead to the next one. So pharmacy tech, this again, U.S. Department of Labor statistics, about $40,000 average for a pharmacy tech. Most of us want a pharmacy that's open and has somebody who knows how to fill your prescription, especially if you've had an accident or you're not feeling well. And again, this position earns less than could afford the median rent rate. And then there's one more of these. Machine assembly. So when we think about, I think Vibroacoustics is actually hiring a lot of engineers that earn a higher wage than this. They're more in the $75,000 to $85,000 a year range. But where we have manufacturers, machine assemblers, those kinds of things in the region, average salaries around $50,000 to $55,000 a year. They're earning enough to afford rent in the community, but they're still earning too little to buy a home unless they have a partner that's earning about the same amount that they are. And so again, you'll see this as a theme. Very often when we have dual income couples, they're faring much better than single adults. But we're also going to get into demographic trends in just a second to talk about how many single adults do we have in the community versus couples with kids or couples without kids. And accommodating those different kinds of households is important. Go ahead, next slide.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you have any information on whether people right now prefer to rent or buy? I think that's a key question.
Yeah. So in terms of preference, I think kind of the culture, the American culture, is still very much a preference towards homeownership when it's available. There are definitely folks who have found a lot more freedom in their job, where they don't have to live close to their job, and they're experimenting with towns, right? I mean, we have folks, their job is based in Massachusetts, they live in Michigan, but a year ago they lived in Colorado, right? And next year they might move to California because they only need to show up to the office maybe 4 times a year. And so those folks, they tend to be higher earners, right? Those folks tend to earn $100,000 a year or more. Those folks tend not to buy a house because when you add in closing costs and your interest rate, you tend not to be able to make money on buying and selling a home in less than a couple of years, just because of all of the costs involved in the transaction. Now, in a really hot market, sometimes you could buy a house and flip it if you're, in that mode. But a lot of those kinds of transient employees would prefer to rent just because they don't want to be tied down to a home. But generally, I would say most people in the United States still want to own if that option is available.
Thank you.
So you get the gist, right? I don't need to walk through this whole thing. Let's go to the next one. So these are the demographic trends for all of Van Buren County, right? So the number of households in Van Buren County, I think, is about 29,000. A little less than a third of all households are single adults with no kids at home. And that includes both seniors and young adults, or adults of any age. And so I think we've got quite a large number of seniors whose adult children have moved out of the house, whether a long time ago or finally in the last couple of years. But then we've also got 2 new generations, both the millennials and Gen Z, that are entering the housing market, that are moving out of their adult parents' homes and into the housing ecosystem. And so if we've got a little more than a quarter of the population are single adults who want to live alone, we don't have anywhere near as many housing units that are designed for single adults who want to live alone. most of our housing supply out there is oriented towards families with kids. So those families with kids do make up a little more than a third of the marketplace, and so our single-family housing supply is really important to them. But then we do also still have a lot of couples without kids at home. Those are mostly seniors, and I should say those are mostly older adults whose kids aren't at home. They might still be in their early to mid-50s, as well as folks who are 65 and older. Increasingly, there are more and more millennials who are choosing not to have kids. This is a growing trend. It's concerning a lot of demographers. If we don't have a lot more kids, it gets harder and harder to pay for social services over time because we need new members in the workforce. But it is a demographic trend. And so again, thinking about if you're two adults, no kids, you want to be mobile, you don't always want to have a single family home on a big lot that requires maintenance and snow shoveling and all the rest. And so as we think about what are the housing solutions, it's very clear that single-family homes that are detached on individual yards are going to continue to be an important part of the mix. But a third to half is probably about what's necessary over the next 30 years, whereas the remainder of the housing supply that's needed really needs to be smaller, lower maintenance units because of the demographic trends we're seeing.
And what type would that be, the lower maintenance? I'm thinking townhomes, things like that, where you don't have the yard maintenance.
Yeah,
and-
townhomes, condominiums, could be small multifamily buildings. I mean, I think what we really want to be thinking about is designing for folks to age in place. And so even if it's going to be young people who are moving in, what we're seeing is the demographic of folks who are 55 and older is going to be a very big generation that is going to live for a very long time, but may not all want to live in homes with stairs and where the master bedroom is on the second floor or even the third floor sometimes. And so thinking about smaller cottages at grade, small multifamily buildings with an elevator, or townhomes with a master suite that's on the main floor. They may still have bedrooms upstairs, but eventually you want to have the ability where the head of household doesn't have to go upstairs to go to sleep. And so allowing for those housing typologies to exist in certain places is going to be really important if we want our local population to be able to age in place, or if we want to allow folks who are going to retire from Grand Rapids or Kalamazoo or Detroit and come over to this part of the state, those folks are going to be looking for those housing types as well. So this is the differential. The bar on the right, that font is really small. The bar on the right is households made up of just one or two individuals without kids at home. And the bar on the left is studio and one-bedroom housing types. So, of course, not every single adult wants to live in a one-bedroom apartment. So these graphs don't need to be equivalent to one another. But you can see the one on the right is about 6 times larger than the one on the left. And we probably want to find a little bit closer to parity between those two over time. Go ahead, next one. So talking about terminology, the more housing comes into the conversation, the more different aphorisms get thrown out there, right? And so we hear terms like affordable or attainable or workforce, and they're sometimes used interchangeably. It's important that we kind of set the definition of the terms that we're going to use and then agree on how we're going to talk about things with those terms. Affordable, generally, the consensus has been what we're talking about is it affordable to you? So it's a relative term, and it basically means if you're spending more than 30% of your income on housing, it's not affordable to you. If you're spending less than 30% of your income, it is affordable to you. And so that is true whether you're earning $100,000 a year, but you're paying, $5,000 a year in rent or mortgage. That would not be affordable to you, even though you've got a fairly high income. Or if you're earning $35,000 a year, but your rent is only $600 a month, that is affordable to you. Now, attainable is a fairly new term that has been thrown around, and frankly, it started to get used because affordable housing was so stigmatized. Right? When we talked about affordable housing, people immediately thought of subsidized housing that wasn't well managed and was going to cause problems in their neighborhood, and so people had a gut reaction against it. And so the term attainable started to be using in reference to housing that isn't subsidized, but does work financially for families and households that earn between 80 and 120% of the median income. And you can see at the bottom, that range of 80 to 120% AMI is anywhere from $44,000 to $95,000 a year in South Haven. And that's based on whether you're a one-person household or a four-person household. And so that's a pretty big range of income, but those tend to be the folks who don't qualify for any kind of subsidy because they make too much money, but they can't quite afford to get into market rate housing because they don't make enough money. And so the idea is, what are all the things that we need to do in order to be able to serve that market today? And for anybody that hasn't bought or rented a home in the last 10 years, if you've been in your home for 10 years or more, this might seem nuts to you, right? Somebody's earning $95,000 a year and they can't afford housing. That sounds crazy. But it's actually what's happening in the market right now. If you go and try to buy a single-family home in most places in West Michigan, it's hard to find something under $400,000 that doesn't need a lot of work. Right? You might be able to find it. You might be able to find something in the $290 to $350 price point, but as you start to pay attention, it's probably going to be 70 or 80 years old, and it probably hasn't been updated in a long time. And as you peel back the drywall or the plaster, you may find some things that require tens of thousands of dollars worth of repairs. So there are still some deals out there if you're handy and you're willing to make some of those sweat equity investments, but it's more and more difficult.
A comment, I definitely like your definition using attainable. We need another synonym because we're using affordable in the definition of attainable.
Yes, thank
So we can come up with a better wording, that would
Yep.
be good. But attainable is what we want to be able to do, in my opinion.
Ryan, just for clarity, so the 30%, that's just the rent payment, and if you're a homeowner, it would be your homeowner's insurance and the interest for your loan. It wouldn't be electric, water.
Right. Well,
correct?
in-
Though generally,
Yes, if you're a renter, it tends to include both rent and
Right.
utilities.
but
Yep,
for home ownership,
that's right.
that falls outside of the 30%.
That's right. The other interesting
It
wrinkle.
affects,
Yeah. The other interesting wrinkle is when you're a homeowner, it doesn't account for annual maintenance and upkeep, right? So you could be spending 30% on mortgage, insurance, and taxes. But if you've got an older home, I mean, I live in a 93-year-old house, and I'm probably spending $6,000 to $10,000 a year, whether it's roof or gutters or paint or something. It always needs something. And so that adds $500 or $600 a month to my monthly cost to maintain that old house. Right? But that's not factored in when we think about home ownership generally. Whereas as a renter, any maintenance or repairs that need to be done, they just get lumped into your rent.
thanks.
Yeah. So quickly, we're going to talk about what does it cost to build housing in the marketplace today, and then we'll compare that to what people can afford. Go ahead to the next one. So this is now a fairly low number compared to what we're seeing in the market. $265 a square foot is about what contractors have to spend in order to build new housing. So if you know the size of your existing home, wherever you live today, multiply your square footage times 265. Let's really get out our phone and use your calculator, because I want you to see what it would cost to build your home today. I mean, as an example, if we were just going to build a simple 1,200 square foot single-family home, the base cost is $318,000 based on this cost of construction. And then assuming you get a relatively cheap lot, $50,000 for an improved lot right now is relatively cheap. It's very difficult to build a new single-family home for less than $368,000. And so for anybody, again, if you bought your house more than 10 years ago, that would have seemed absurd for $368,000 to be the starter home price. But that's the market we're in right now. We had a period of time where we really didn't build any new starter homes. We lost a lot of our construction labor supply during the Great Recession. And then during COVID, we saw all this inflationary pricing of wood, plywood, materials, all those things, and we haven't really seen prices come back down since then. So with those construction costs, if we assume, let's assume we're gonna find a builder that's willing to do things as inexpensively as possible, and we can get our costs down to $250 a square foot. $250 a square foot times $800 or an 800 square foot apartment means we're gonna build that apartment likely for no less than $200,000 for just a basic 2-bedroom, 800 square foot apartment. Now, in today's market, the way apartment construction works is generally the builder or developer is going to finance about 80% of the cost. They'll have to bring about 20% equity to the table. They'll finance the other 80%, but that financing costs them 7% in the marketplace. And so after they build the apartment, what they have to be able to do is pay the debt on the loan. They've got to be able to operate and maintain the building in good condition. They've got to pay the taxes. All of those things add up to the point that ultimately what they end up charging is about $1,800 a month for a new 2-bedroom apartment. This is what we're seeing in the marketplace. When there's no tax incentive, no subsidy, no anything else, generally a new 2-bedroom apartment is going to cost around $1,800 a month. A new 1,200 square foot home, as we mentioned earlier, even if we can, really bid down some of those costs from what I showed you earlier, if we can get it done for $300,000, mortgage and taxes are still $2,600 a month. And so achieving affordability at those unit sizes and types gets difficult. But we're like just barely in the ballpark for that 80% to 120% median income price point. Again, that's households earning $44,000 to $95,000 a year. Those higher income earners below $95,000 a year could likely get into the apartment pretty easily, probably getting close to being priced out of homeownership. Go ahead, next slide. So with those price points, if our desired rent was $1,250 a month instead of the $1,800 a month I shared with you earlier, we would need a pretty substantial subsidy to bring to the table because what we're doing is offsetting the cost on the front end. Same with if we want to get a mortgage down. My first mortgage when I bought my first house 22 years ago, first mortgage was $900 a month, right? And so to achieve that for somebody fresh out of college, we'd need a subsidy of close to $225,000. So that's all of the depressing stuff for the night. We're going to try to move on to what are the potential solutions here. Generally, the way I talk about this is as a 3-legged stool. We've got the regulatory environment, which is where you come in, planning and zoning. We've got development incentives, and then we have patient and impact capital. And sometimes that means it's a grant from the state. Sometimes it means we've got philanthropy at the local level, or it might mean we've got a local business owner who's willing to invest money and not see much of a rate of return for the first 5 or 10 years because they need their employees to have housing. This body doesn't have any control over number 2 and 3, right? And so those conversations are going to be left to both the city council as well as the community foundation and the business community. We can't necessarily control 2 and 3 in the master plan or the zoning ordinance. But number 1 is your bailiwick, right? Number 1 is what you actually have a fair amount of control over. Now, there are going to be other elements related to the building code and the fire code that also add cost and make things more expensive. And again, we can't really play in those spaces. You can advocate at the state level for legislation, but we're really just going to talk about zoning here. Go ahead. So the caveat here is, and I didn't mention this earlier, it's worth repeating a couple of times. Zoning all by itself, like just allowing for more things to get built in a different way, doesn't automatically make anything really affordable, right? We're not going to achieve rents or mortgages that are substantially less expensive. But we are going to find marginal gains, right? And so what I don't want to do is give you the impression that changing the zoning or the master plan is this magic bullet that solves for housing affordability and suddenly we'll have ubiquitous and abundant housing supply for everybody. But what zoning does do is it creates a lot more opportunity for choices in the marketplace, and it allows for more product to get built. So whenever we build new housing, the new housing tends to be some of the most expensive housing in the community. If you had 2 homes side by side that were the exact same square footage, exact same level of finish, one's brand new and one's 80 years old, almost every time, the brand new one is going to be more expensive than the one that's 80 years old. So new construction by itself is expensive, but when we can build enough over time, and as a planning body, you're normally thinking in 5 to 30-year time increments. So we're thinking about, if you're updating the master plan, it tends to be a 30-year document that gets updated every 5 years. How do we start to set the community up for over the next 30 years to create enough of the kinds of housing that the community will need over that period of time, in partnership with your regional allies, right? So you're probably not going to solve for all of the housing needs just in the city of South Haven. You're going to need the townships that surround you and probably the entire county to be pulling some weight on this conversation as well. But thinking about what are some of those things, what are some of the dials that you can adjust in order to allow an incremental increase in the types of housing that are currently available. So generally speaking, these are the 5 categories that impact the cost of development. You've got land, you've got the actual physical construction, you've got your design costs, so your architecture and engineering, your permitting and professional fees, so you're still going to hire a surveyor for almost anything that gets built. There's a process to come to you all and have the site plan reviewed, or to go through the special land use process or a variance process. And then there's just the cost of capital, right? What's the interest rate on the loan, and what do my investors expect to get as a return on investment? Many of these categories you have some influence over via the zoning ordinance and ergo the master plan. So land you can influence by how many homes can get built on a particular piece of property. If I buy 1 acre in the city and I can only build 1 home on it, and an acre is $100,000, my cost of land per unit is $100,000. But if I can build 6 homes or 8 homes on that same piece of property, my cost of land per unit comes down substantially. And so the way that you plan and zone for housing on the land allows you to impact the price of that land on a per housing unit basis. Now for construction, when we think about how do we impact the cost of construction, well, you can impact the cost of lumber or drywall or light fixtures, but you can impact how much of building needs to get built in order to serve a household. And so when we've got 1/4 to 1/3 of households who are single adults, if you're allowing for smaller units to get built, that can reduce the overall cost of construction on a per unit basis. Or if you're allowing for less parking to have to be built on a per unit basis, that's less cost of construction on a per unit basis. For design, really the way you can influence design is by getting really clear in your standards about what you want to see in the community. So if I'm a builder or a developer and I have to guess, I'm going to say, all right, I read the standards to the zoning ordinance. I think I can design a site plan that they're going to like, but I'm not entirely sure, and I bring you a plan with a lot of modern housing types with weird angles or flat roofs or something like that, and everybody on the board says, whoa, that's not what we wanted to see. Now I've got to go back to my architect and redesign the whole plan, and that adds cost to the project. So the more clarity you can provide in the master plan about these are the building types, this is the neighborhood character that we're after. If you bring us a site plan that looks like the existing city or looks like some version of the future city that you have clearly articulated, it's going to save professional fees, it's going to save design costs and all the rest. And then on the financing side, this is really about how long it takes somebody to get through the approval process. If a builder or a developer has to buy land or put land under contract and then go through a 1-year or a 2-year or a 3-year approval process before they can start construction, they're going to pay for all of that time that they were under review, right? And most developers are going to do everything possible not to eat that cost, but to pass the cost on to the end renter or buyer. And so the shorter the time period required in order to get an approval, the less of that cost needs to get passed on. But it doesn't mean that you need to just allow anything to get built. What it means is having much greater clarity of standard so that you can either say no right away, right? You can say, nope, this clearly doesn't meet any of our standards. We were very clear in articulating them in the zoning ordinance or the master plan. You failed, your plan is rejected. You want to get to know as quickly as possible, but you also want to If it meets your standards, you want to say yes as quickly as possible and empower staff to say yes as quickly as possible. So again, it doesn't mean sacrificing quality. You still want to really demand the highest possible quality that you can get, but be very clear about what your expectations are and be quick to an answer, yes or no. Good. Okay, so now we're going to go through a series of housing types that generally are hard to build, but are in high demand. So for the most part, small lot houses are really difficult to build in most places in West Michigan. And by small lot, what I mean is lots that are less than 7,500 square feet tend not to be very easy to find and are generally not buildable, right? I don't know, what's the minimum lot size in South Haven? 5,000. Great. All right, so you're trending in the right direction. If you'll go to the next slide, I'll give you some kind of minimum criteria that we like to think about. So this is a very small lot, right? And in most older municipalities, when you've got older housing stock that was platted 80 or 100 years ago, you're going to find little funny lots like this, right? At some point, somebody subdivided their traditional lot, and you've got a house that kind of looks like it's just barely fits on the lot. But there's enough room for the house and the garage, and there's kind of a little flower garden around the perimeter, but there's maybe 5 to 10 feet of green space around the entire house, and that's it. That's actually a really affordable way to allow more housing. And so here what you're seeing is the lot size for this house is somewhere in the 1,800 to 2,400 square foot lot size. It's still a single family house. In this instance, what we've said is because the lot is small, the house is small, right? We're not going to try to pack a giant house on a little lot. And so you might either want to have some floor area ratio requirements, or you might want to say, you know what, the building can't be taller than 1.5 stories, as illustrated here. And you'll still have green space requirements, right? They can't build lot line to lot line. They've got to have setbacks and a particular amount of green space. But this is an opportunity where you've got existing single-family neighborhoods, and you feel like, you know what, it has to stay single-family. The neighbors would never allow us to change zoning from single-family to anything else. There may be some homeowners who say, you know what, this side yard has kind of always been here. We don't do anything with it but mow it. Maybe at one point the kids set up a volleyball net or badminton or something, but that was 20 years ago. You may find some folks who say, you know what, we're willing to sell the 30 or 40 feet next to our house because we don't ever use that lot anymore. And that lot might cost $30,000 or $40,000 for somebody to buy, and then they can build a $250,000 home on it. That's a great starter home opportunity for young families, or it's a great ADA accessible small cottage opportunity for aging adults who want to stay in the community, but they're currently living in a 2-story house with too many stairs, right? Any questions about this? Okay. So now the next one is the row house design. Now this is one that I typically recommend is either part of or adjacent to a commercial district. In certain neighborhoods on the East Coast, or maybe as you get into kind of Grand Rapids, Lansing, or Detroit, this could fit in a more traditional single-family neighborhood. But what I want you to think about is Broadway Avenue, Phoenix, right? You've got a couple of primary arterials where you could be allowing for this type of housing solution where it could be single-family owner-occupied, but it's built lot line to lot line. The brick version might be more urban than you would see in South Haven. You might get a lap siding kind of a version here architecturally. But if you'll go to the next slide, as we look at the zoning standards here, again, lot size is about the same, 1,800 to 2,400 square feet. You can still have green space in the back. This works really well if you think about some of the kind of strip retail commercial patterns that you've got on Broadway. You've got some older retail that is either partially vacant or fully vacant on relatively large lots. It could be an acre, acre and a half. Filling in some of those lots with housing typologies like this can work financially. As long as there's not a lot of demand for that property as a retail property, right? It's got more value commercially than it does residentially. But as those properties start to sit, or when they're too small to do anything on commercially, allowing for these kinds of infill development can be a good solution. And what I'll say is I'm not married to any of these, right? So these are ideas to get you guys thinking about the housing types that are appropriate and where they belong. So anything I show you, you can say, nope, not for us. But just want to give you examples along with standards that can work. Go ahead, next one. So the duplex is a housing typology that I think has a lot of stigma attached to it. And in my opinion, the stigma really came from homes that were built in the 70s and 80s. In the 70s and 80s, we did really bad architecture. Like generally, there wasn't a lot of great architecture that came out of that time period. And so I always think about that low slung duplex that was almost all garage in the front, and you kind of drive by it, it's on those higher kind of arterial corridors. The lawn was never maintained. It had maybe some straggly bushes. You had no idea who lived there because all you could see was the garage. I wouldn't recommend building that type of duplex. But pre-World War II, there was a lot of this kind of building construction that happened. And very often what occurred with this type of building is it would be owner-occupied on one side, and the owner would then use the other side of the duplex to generate income to offset their mortgage. And so these are great opportunities for first-time home buyers or for young families that are trying to build some wealth in the community to generate a little bit of equity, to use the rent to offset their mortgage, and become investors in the community. Now, duplexes, there are some communities in the U.S. that are starting to allow these by right in any neighborhood. My feeling from the number of workshops that I've done is in South Haven is duplexes by right in any neighborhood probably isn't a good idea, right? The community's not asking for that. I don't think the community's ready for it. But again, there may be a handful of arterial streets that have a little bit higher traffic, that have seen a little bit less investment over the last 30 years, where that building typology does make sense and where it could be value add in the neighborhood. The other thing that I've seen some communities do is allow for this building typology by right only on vacant lots. And so you have the ability to make that distinction and say you can do a duplex by right on a vacant lot, but if the lot is currently occupied by a single family home, you have to go through special land use if you think you're going to tear down that single family house and replace it with a duplex. Now, the one thing I'll say to that is in the South Haven market right now, it's so expensive to buy a single family home. It's probably unlikely that anybody would buy a single family home just to tear it down and replace it with 2 units. You're probably not going to earn a return on investment in that scenario. But if you wanted to really put regulatory law in place to prevent that from happening regardless, you could do that special land use process except where you have vacant properties. So if you go to the next one.
Brian,
Yeah.
how many square feet is each unit? I mean, that looks huge.
Oh, yeah. So that example was probably pretty big. I mean, those were the 2 stories on each side. And so those were probably 1,600 to 1,800 square foot units.
That's, okay.
So those were like, your whole family lives, right? Those are families with kids that are going to move in, or even multi-generational family. You can for sure do it smaller. The version that we've illustrated is a bit smaller, but this could still be definitely 2-bed, 2-bath on each side. And so assume you've got living, dining, kitchen on the main floor, probably with a half bath, and then 2 bedrooms and a full bath upstairs on each side. Works out really well for young couples. Even after they have their first kid, it still works out really well. The second or third kid, they probably start to say, all right, we're ready to move into a single family house with a yard and all the rest. One of the things here in this illustration, just to make these look a little bit better, we've always tucked the parking in the rear. We have designed these so that you can always get enough parking on the lot, but we put it in the back because if you put a bunch of cars out front, that's never an attractive thing to draw or design. But you can, if you were going to say, you know what, we're going to have the garage next to the building with the driveway on the side, you're probably going to want to add another 10 to 20 feet to the lot width. But here, what you can see is you can easily fit a good-sized duplex on a 42-foot wide lot that's somewhere in the 3,200 to 5,000 square foot lot size range. And so one of the things to note, oftentimes what we'll see in communities is they'll say, we're going to allow duplexes by right, but instead of the minimum 5,000 square foot lot size, you've got to have 7,500 square feet of lot area. and they think, well, this is how we're going to limit duplexes from taking over the neighborhood. Well, by increasing that minimum lot size requirement, you're basically saying these are possible in name only, right? Because, sorry, Mary, go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead. No.
Well, what happens when you increase the lot area requirement to build something that you may be articulating you would like to see in some places, what has to happen then is the builder has to buy 2 lots. Because if the standard lot, okay,
So in our area, our R1As are the 50 feet
Yep.
wide, but our R1Bs are actually 66
okay,
feet wide. And we actually have a R1C that's only 33 feet wide, and that's actually only, so that has a 2178 square footage.
Great.
But there's very few of those.
yeah. As long as you only have to buy 1 lot in order to build what you're allowing for, it's great, right? If you establish a lot width or a lot area requirement that forces somebody to buy 2 lots in order to make it work, it's going to be a really rare occurrence that they find 2 lots side by side that they can afford to buy together and then combine. So you've got a better, deeper working knowledge of the local zoning and
Oh, I pulled it
parcel
up.
sizes. Okay, great.
I'm cheating.
No, that's fine. But yeah, I think the point is, if you think you want to allow for it, allow it to occur at least in a minimum, like, do the math on your existing parcels and make sure that there are existing parcels that actually meet the lot size requirements. All right, we'll go to the next one. Again, this is duplex. Again, this is a huge building. This could be a 4-unit or a 6-unit. In this instance, it's just a 2-unit for the purpose of discussion. But what it does is it illustrates, instead of 2 units that are side by side, you can have 2 units that are one on top of the other. And this is a classic iteration, more colonial style architecture. What's that? Yes. Yes, it probably is, I don't know, it's Charleston or Washington, D.C. or something, I don't know. But go to the next slide and we'll talk about standards. So with the up-down version, because you're getting all of the unit on one floor, you can have a narrower lot width, right? Now, if your minimum, what's the minimum?
33.
33 feet, okay. So technically, you should be able to build a duplex pretty easily on a 33-foot lot. It doesn't mean you want to allow it, but technically it's totally possible. It probably wouldn't look super out of place. You could do it. So generally speaking, that ground floor unit is going to be somewhere between 16 feet wide and 24 feet wide. You can get a really nice floor plan in a 16-foot wide footprint, and it's basically you're going to have living room in the front, dining room in the middle, kitchen in the back with a little half bath. And if you imagine your own floor plan, you've probably got a number of rooms that feel pretty good that are 16 feet wide. It might be 16 by 24 is your primary living space, and then you've got a kitchen that could be an open kitchen that opens up to that. So with that kind of a building width, anywhere from 16 feet to 24 feet, it fits pretty nicely on lots that will range from that 28 to 40 feet wide. Again, it doesn't mean you have to allow for it, but this is kind of how you can code for it. Go ahead, next one. So this is a triplex. You can do these where you've got individual units side by side. The third one is above the garage. Or if you go to the next one, here we've shown it where you've got, you can either do a garden level unit with one in the middle, and maybe there's, so if it's a triplex, you're either getting main floor, second floor, third floor, or garden level main floor, second floor, with those dormers as being a little bit more aesthetic than anything. Now, again, in South Haven, you might only have 1 or 2 locations in the whole city where you say, oh yeah, we're going to allow 3 units to be stacked on top of each other. But again, as I was coming in on Phoenix, next to the bank right there on the corner, I think, of Broadway and Phoenix, there's a vacant lot just to the east of the bank. You could probably put 2 of these on that vacant lot pretty easily with enough parking in the rear. And so I think about those kinds of contexts. That lot, I think, is probably too small to build a traditional multifamily building, but you could do something like this on that kind of property, or you could do a single fourplex or something like that. Go ahead, next slide. So here's the fourplex. Like you're seeing the pattern here. Go ahead to the next one. Now here, this generally is 2 up, 2 down. You can either build these, historically these were often done where you've got 2 identical units on the main floor and with identical mirror images on the second floor. There are some really nice versions of this that I've seen where you've got 1 2-bedroom and 1 bedroom on the ground floor and then a mirror image upstairs. Most of the time, what I would encourage is when you're allowing these to get built, you require the architecture to look very similar to the architecture that's already in the neighborhood. And so what you'll say is, if the house is comparable to other homes on the same block, you can have a building that's like this. And then you're going to still have the standards for green space. You're going to have minimum parking requirements. But you don't need to force them onto a super huge lot. Right here, what we're talking about is a 40 by 100 foot lot, probably at minimum. I'm not sure you can do a fourplex on a smaller lot than that. But you could go up to 7,500, 8,000 square feet if you wanted to. Often what happens when you require a larger minimum lot size requirement is the house really starts to look out of place because it's got all of this extra green space on either side, because you could still fit the building on half the lot size, but because they had to have the land available, it's there, and then it starts to stick out more. The more it really fits and feels like the rest of the homes on the block, and it sits on a lot that's similar in size to the rest of the homes on the block, these can work really well. And often what can happen, here we've illustrated this where there's 2 steps up. You can design these to be 0 step so that you can walk right in on the ground floor at grade. You can wheel in if you're in a wheelchair. As often as possible, we recommend that we try to make these, at least the bottom 2 units, ADA accessible. Technically, ADA doesn't come into play until you're building 5 units or more. But we often advocate to try to get at least half of the units ADA accessible no matter what. Just because we're going to have more and more folks in the community who are going to need that accommodation. And so often we'll refer to it as universal design or inclusive design, just because there's going to be a share of the population that needs it.
Ryan?
Yeah.
What about height?
So generally what I would say is match the height that's currently in the neighborhood. 35 feet is generally going to be enough if that's your current standard. You don't really need to go any taller than that. Sometimes you'll have a neighborhood that's been, 1940s or 1960s ranches for a long time. I tend to be biased towards starting to allow the, traditional 2-story buildings in those neighborhoods. But you could say, hey, we're only going to allow buildings that match the height and massing of the existing stuff, and then you're stuck with single story.
We're at 35, so that's...
I think that's plenty. Okay, but not 2.5. Okay. So if you decided you wanted to allow for the stacked triplex or something else, you might want to allow that half story so that you can get a half story below grade. That also works really well, especially for the 3 or 4 unit if you want to have, now you often will end up seeing in-unit laundry, so every single unit will have their own washer and dryer. It used to be oftentimes they'd put the laundry down in the basement and it was shared for everybody in the building. And so there, if you have that garden level with lots of natural light, it's nicer to go down and do the laundry. But to be honest, for the most part, you can fit a stackable washer and dryer in just about any closet, so it might not be necessary. So this one is kind of a new one. You'll see these in older neighborhoods. I live in Grand Rapids. The Heritage Hill neighborhood is an old historic neighborhood. There are a bunch of old houses that are 4,000 to 7,000 square feet that have been converted into multi-unit buildings that are now 6 or 8 or 10 apartments sometimes. In some instances, those conversions are beautiful, right? They restored all of the wood. They've got really nice kitchens and countertops and all the rest. In some instances, they were done terribly, right? Where they kind of chopped up the building, the rooms are awkward, nothing really fits, the doors don't close all the way. But brand new construction is a different story. This may or may not be a good choice for South Haven. I included it just in case. Oftentimes we recommend these in higher end communities that are building big new suburbs, sort of the large estate style homes. Because what can often happen is when you build those big estate neighborhoods is mostly you get single family or you get families with kids moving in, sometimes retirees. But oftentimes somebody's living situation will change over the course of 10 or 20 years that they live there. So parents might get divorced, or a partner passes away, or the kids move out. But your community is still in that neighborhood, right? You've gotten to know all of the neighbors. Somebody takes care of your cat who lives down the street. You don't still need your own place that's 4,200 square feet. But if you could have a condo that's on the same block or around the corner where you can still socialize with all your neighbors, you still know everybody in the community, having a building that looks like this but has 6 or 7 units in it can be a really great way to allow people to age in place and not feel like, well, it's off to the old folks' home for me. You can have these types of housing in more traditional estate neighborhoods. If you'll go to the next one. You can also code for this to work well in a more traditional neighborhood. So the building I showed you before was a little more modern. You know, it looked a little more suburban. This can fit. And oftentimes what we saw in more traditional towns like South Haven is you might have just on the edge of downtown what was a bed and breakfast, or it might have even been a boarding house in the 1920s or 1930s that ultimately gets converted into 4 or 6 or 8 apartment units. And again, these can work really well. You can do these 0 steps, so they're ADA. But the cost to build per unit, this is an important one because you could do a 650 square foot, 1-bedroom condo in one of these for under $200,000. And because you're saving on your land cost and you're sharing on the construction cost, you can actually hit that price point pretty well. And so your first year teacher or your young firefighter who says, you know what, I want to own something in town, I want to build up equity, these are great opportunities for somebody to buy into the market if we're allowing for them. Go ahead, next slide. And I think this might, no, there's probably 2 more. So the apartment house, these work best closer to downtown on commercial corridors, higher traffic corridors. You've had a couple of these built in downtown South Haven recently. I think A.J. Veneklassen just did one a couple of years ago. So this is like the old historic version, just for nostalgia's sake. But if you go to the next slide, allowing these to get built so that they can come right up to the sidewalk in that more kind of downtown sort of a landscape is really valuable. It creates a sense of place. Tucking that parking in behind instead of allowing it to be in the front where people are walking by, it generally is the preferred methodology. Here you can see this is possible on a 38-foot wide lot. One thing that's important, and this is getting a little bit technical, we've got draft legislation that is moving through the state house right now. Representative Grant has introduced it, that would allow single stair access to buildings like this. And why that's important is for the last 50 years or so, anytime you build 3 stories with more than 4 units, you have to have 2 stairwells accessible to every unit. That requirement was put in place before the building code required every unit to be sprinkled in multifamily, right? And so it used to be, well, if there's a fire, you know, and you can't get out one way, you need to have a second set of stairs. But now 89% of all fires are suppressed by the sprinkler system in multifamily buildings that have been built since 1984. And so that double stair requirement is no longer necessary. And there are jurisdictions across the US that have eliminated the double stair requirement and have seen 0 increases in the total number of fire-related accidents and or deaths. And so there are a number of states right now that are considering eliminating the double stair. And the reason that that's important is because when we require double stairs, it consumes a lot of the footprint of the building. And ultimately what happens is on a small building like this is you end up having a really awkward footprint, or the building just doesn't work at all because you've consumed so much of the footprint with stairwells and hallways. But the single stair allows this kind of building to work. So hopefully by summer of next year, that legislation will have been passed and enabled, and you can start to allow for this type of building. This might actually fit next to that Fifth Third Bank property on Phoenix. I think it's a Fifth Third. Am I getting that right? Or is it Huntington? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think there's one more. So the Muse. Muse is a funny word. So these tend to be homes that are built on a narrow alleyway. And sometimes it's just a pedestrian lane. Sometimes they're designed for cars, sometimes they're just designed for people. But the idea is it's kind of a close-in sort of a neighborhood. It's stacked units. Let's go to the next one so we can talk about standards. This can work really well, depending on the location, tucked immediately behind a commercial building. So if you've got retail up front, you can tuck this building right behind the commercial and then still have an alleyway behind it. And it's sort of like an accessory dwelling unit that lives behind a commercial building instead of an accessory dwelling unit that lives behind a house. It's a great way to use underutilized land. I think about these. There was, I've got a friend that built a series of these right behind a grocery store on the south side of Grand Rapids. And they sold immediately. They were all for sale. They sold really well. And you actually drove behind the grocery store in order to pull into your garage. But there were a number of people. They were in a neighborhood with $400,000 homes across the street. They look like townhomes from the street, but you access it from behind the grocery store. So these are great ways to really think about where do we have commercial space where there's just like asphalt and nobody's using it. We're not actually even parking cars on it. We just paved it for some reason. You can tuck these kinds of buildings in those locations. And then oh yeah, okay. There's two more? Okay. The infamous accessory dwelling unit. One of the really important things about ADUs is the occupancy requirements. So what we've found is a lot of communities will say, well, you can build an ADU, except it has to be occupied by a relative. Or they'll say it has to be occupied by one of the two buildings on the property has to be occupied by the homeowner. Those are really well-intentioned regulations, but they make them much harder to build financially. Because ultimately what happens when the unit has to be owner-occupied or occupied by a family member, it makes sense for that first generation, right? So the first person that's going to build it, they're going to build it for their mother-in-law or for their adult child who's going to stay home. But when they then want to sell the house, when they say, okay, we're ready to move to another property, the buyer is going to devalue the accessory dwelling unit. They're going to say, why do I care about an accessory dwelling unit? I don't have a family member that I want living on my property. And so the assessed value drops because you can't just sell it on the open market as a habitable unit. It's got this occupancy restriction. And so ultimately what you end up doing is you build it because it's for a family member, not because it makes financial sense. And so for some people that works really well, but it tends to be a very small sliver of the population that they're willing to say, I'm going to invest $150,000 or $200,000 in an accessory dwelling unit, and I'm not going to get my money out of that when I sell the house. But, so then what you want to think about is, okay, so how do we make sure that these don't become sort of a nuisance issue in our neighborhoods? And what you want to do is define what you would consider to be a nuisance that you think might be associated with the accessory dwelling unit, and then regulate those behaviors, right? So if it's parking, then we regulate the parking appropriately so that we can enforce the parking standard and we don't have to run into those issues. If it's, well, where are they going to put their trash, right? We have a regulation that articulates clearly, well, the trash has to go in a particular location. We don't want to just outlaw the building typology because we're not sure how to regulate some of those nuisance behaviors. We just get creative about how to regulate the potential nuisance behaviors. And so, yep, here's a way that we can code for those. Cost to build an ADU anywhere from $125. I mean, you could go more expensive than $225. $125 is the lowest I've seen recently. We are seeing more and more companies that are building these prefab where you can essentially order them online and they'll get delivered to the house. And as long as they can kind of pull it into the driveway, they can drop the whole unit on an approved slab. Those are a little bit less expensive, but if it's site built, unless the homeowner builds it themselves, right? If you've got a handy homeowner, they might be able to build it for under $100,000. But that can be a really inexpensive housing option for seasonal employees, again, for single adults, for teachers. In many instances, we're exploring right now how do we encourage older homeowners who are low and moderate income homeowners. How do we help them finance an ADA accessible accessory dwelling unit in their own backyard that they then can move into and rent out their house to a young family that needs the bigger home? So it's a really affordable way for an aging senior to age in place if they don't have a retirement strategy. And did you say there's one more still? Oh, the cottage court. This one's actually my favorite. So these are adorable. They work super well for those demographics that aren't traditional families with kids, even a family with that likes, the more compact unit size. These are great. So the idea here is you've got a limited footprint, typically somewhere in the 5,000 to 10,000 square foot range for a lot size, and you do 3 or 6 or 10 cottages on a shared lot. If you'll go to the next one, you'll see how we lay this out. So these, the general standard is you want somewhere between 25 and 80 feet of separation between the cottages. And so kind of depending on the feel that you want, this actually can feel really nice. It creates like a nice hallway kind of a style on that center sidewalk. If you want more space or you want a green space for kids to play on, you have a bigger courtyard in the middle. But here you can see we're about, that's probably 12,000 square feet. I can't do the math in my head. It's 150 feet deep by 80 feet wide. Again, we're tucking parking in the back. It's not always possible to put parking in the back if you don't have an alleyway or a corner lot. So sometimes the parking goes in on the side. It doesn't have to be 6. It could be 3. It could be 4 or 5. The city of Frankfurt actually just adopted standards for cottage courtyards, and they adopted some specific standards that said a cottage courtyard is only available when a portion of the housing is attainable to that middle income workforce, right? 80 to 120% AMI. So their standards are online. I can send them to Kelly. But this is a really attractive housing typology that a lot of people want, both younger households and older households. And they tend to be smaller homes that fit really well in lots of little nooks and crannies where you've got a couple of vacant parcels.
What distance did you say between the homes?
Typically between 25 and 80 feet. So there's a guy named Ross Chapin. I think he's based in the Pacific Northwest. He coined the term pocket neighborhood. He's become the most famous architect who designs these. He's got a book about them. And he'll really break down kind of the design typology and say you either want a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-2 ratio between the height of the building and the distance between buildings. And there's a whole like design ideology around that. And so if you get really interested in how do we design these kinds of things really well, Ross Chapin is the architect, and he's got lots of resources online. Okay, I think then we're done. So live, work, these are your downtown buildings, right? You allow the mixed use on the ground floor, residential upstairs. These have worked for hundreds of years. They create really nice walkable neighborhoods. If you'll go to the next slide. So in some markets, these still make sense. Again, we want to only have to build 1 stair. 2 stairs just takes up too much room. These kinds of buildings, I would generally advise, don't require any parking. Because the lot is so small, once you start accommodating parking, you just run out of room. Because it's in a downtown environment, people are going to be used to parking on the street. The criticism you're going to get is businesses are going to say, well, we need the parking for our residents, or for our customers. My pushback to that tends to be, and take it or leave it, tends to be nobody owns the public right-of-way other than the public trust, right? To decide that customers are more important than residents or residents are more important than customers. We have the same dialogue when people park their cars on street in front of their single-family homes. I don't own the parking spot in front of my house. My neighbor doesn't own the parking spot in front of their house. It's a public right-of-way. And so I tend to advise don't try to force parking onto these lots. There will be a battle, right? If you don't require parking, folks will get upset about it. It's up to you to do whatever you want. I tend to think in this kind of environment where everybody can walk, it's not worth forcing because it just adds a lot of cost without a lot of value. Now are we done? Oh, okay, this is really the last one. So this is just for you to know, in addition to all of the kind of ways you can think about planning and zoning for those housing typologies, the city council has the ability to use these other tools to offset costs. And so the brownfield tax increment finance is the most important one. It's the most significant one. Basically, it's a tool that allows the council to reimburse a builder or developer for their eligible costs by using the new tax increment that gets generated as a result of the development.
And now it's not limited to brownfield.
Now you can
So,
use it anywhere there's
Changes
housing.
last year.
Yeah. So that's a big one. And I think, Mary, I don't know, I would say the council seems like they're pretty open to using that tool for the right project. Would you say?
I would agree with that.
Yeah. So as you start to allow for different types of housing, know that those types of housing can be paired with some financial incentives to make the math work. And there are some carrots and sticks baked into that, so you can require a certain level of affordability for households earning in that 80 to 120% AMI range. Just to wrap up, you've got a decent amount of flexibility to allow more housing types. All of the types that I've shared are going to be less expensive to build on a per home basis than typical single family homes. They're not going to be cheap, right? They're still going to feel like, gosh, this is really expensive. If we can pair it with some of these tools, we can bring the costs down in order to hit that middle income price point. But the goal here is to get more housing stock into the marketplace so that the older stuff doesn't continue to feel all that upward pressure because people can't find anything else. So we left some time for dialogue before your regular meeting.
Actually, 3 questions on 2 topics. Let's go back to your assertion about the home ownership still being kind of the American dream. Is it trending down, however? Because I read a lot about, younger people. They're more about experience in life. Mm-hmm. They don't see a house as being a good investment anymore. They'd rather put it in their 401k. Yeah. So in terms of the mix of rental versus own, is the trend seeming downward, even though you say most people are still wanting to buy?
Yeah, yes, it definitely is trending downward. I think it used to be like 90% of young adults were saying, yeah, they wanted to own a home someday, and it's now down in the like low 80s, high 70s, and does continue to trend downward. I think a lot of economists and demographers are questioning, right, is it because a lot of those young people saw what happened during the foreclosure crisis, and there's still a little bit of trauma associated with that? And as they start families, are they going to be interested in buying again? We don't know, right? That trend could just continue downward. I mean, there are plenty of really great communities in other cities and other countries where the homeownership rate is below 50%, and they're beautiful towns. Right now, we're still hearing a lot of people will say they want to own a home someday.
And then the second question is a little bit longer term. So I think there are a number of experts that are pretty convinced that within the next 30 years there'll be a climate migration. Mm-hmm. And then there's a lot of them that think that the Great Lakes is going to be the place to go. Yep. And then a lot are also saying Michigan is going to be one of the hot spots. I know there are a number of communities around the Great Lakes who are already planning for that. The question I have is, from a housing standpoint, we don't want to wait till year 25 to start planning for this. What should a city on the Great Lakes now, in the next 5 years, since that's where we're updating our master plan, what should we be doing from a housing standpoint beyond what you've said to plan for that migration?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And I think what you really want to be doing is thinking about how do you allow housing stock and the neighborhood fabric to thicken incrementally over time, right? So if you were to say, oh, we're going to plan for the 30-year in-migration now and start to allow it tomorrow, everybody's going to be like, whoa, that was way too much, way too fast. But to start to build in some provisions that allow you to revisit what you're allowing for on that 5-year incremental time period, and continue to have the conversation with the community about those demographic trends. Who is moving in and why, and what are their preferences? And to have that continued dialogue, because we will see a shift if we're paying attention to it over those 5 and 10-year time increments, but it's not noticeable day to day, right? It's not going to be something, unless things get really bad, it's not going to be something that people are like, whoa, like people are coming in by the station wagon full every day. It's going to be increments of 30 or 40 new folks that might not have otherwise moved in. But a lot of the folks who may move into the West Michigan market, and we saw this during COVID, right? What we saw during COVID was a lot of folks who were in really pricey markets were suddenly allowed to work from home. And they may have grown up in Michigan, they may have had some past experience in Michigan, and they said, Michigan's pretty darn cheap, right? Compared to Denver or Boston or Seattle. I think we'll continue to see more of that as work from home patterns probably continue. The same thing could happen with a climate migration is the folks who are able to move in are gonna be higher income. And because they've got the ability to migrate. And so they will push up the price of homes, whether it's because of a work from home trend or a climate trend. Know that those new folks moving in will likely earn more than folks who live here today. And so I think you want to be planning for how do we thicken the housing stock incrementally so that it's not all at once.
Thank you.
I have a question regarding the demographics that you presented at the beginning. And my question is, as we look at our master plan, should we be looking at those current demographics that you gave us? Or should we be looking further out at what we want to develop in terms of demographics in our communities?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I mean, your master plan is a 30-year document. And so you want to be like the folks who are 55 and older today, many of them will still be around in 30 years and will have different needs. I mean, one of the other kind of future casting trends that I'm hearing a lot about is because the state of healthcare is improving in terms of the quality of healthcare we're getting, regardless of cost, folks are going to live longer, right? We're expecting a lot more centenarians in the next 2 decades than we've ever had before. And so thinking about how do we allow our housing stock to adapt to an aging population, while also thinking about what is this next generation looking for as they move in, and how do we provide enough housing to accommodate all of those generations that are going to want to live in the community. And it's probably not going to look like what we've had in the community for the last 50 years. The other thing I would say, and we didn't really talk a lot about it today, is your infrastructure in the ground is a fixed cost, right? And for every linear foot of infrastructure, it costs generally the same amount to replace. And so whether you have one home producing new taxable value on that same frontage of infrastructure, or 2 homes or 4 homes or 6 homes, you're going to have to replace that infrastructure eventually. But the more taxable value you're able to generate early on in the process, the more comfortable you get being able to pay for that infrastructure over time. And so there's a limit to that, right? Like if you're over consuming the infrastructure, that's not a good thing. But really thinking about what is our infrastructure sized for, what could it handle, relatively speaking, and allowing for that incremental increase in density over time so that we are able to pay to replace the 70 and 80-year-old pipes in a few years. And we've generated enough tax increment to do that. But we haven't drastically changed the character of our neighborhoods to the point that it's no longer recognizable as South Haven, right? It's how do we strike that middle balance?
And that's a good point. And what do you think of form-based zoning?
So I think form-based zoning can be really valuable. In regard to the slide where we talked about the 5 different types of costs, design being one of them, a form-based code takes the guesswork out of design for an architect or a developer. What you want to make sure of, though, is that you hire a consultant that really understands what it costs to build the building that you're coding for. And there are some great consultants out there that do really, really good work in that regard. There are also some consultants that kind of just borrow standards from other communities and don't quite understand how it impacts the local market. And so you just want to have a consultant that you trust draft that language and have them draft it for the South Haven market. Don't borrow from South Bend or from Illinois or Denver because cost of construction and materials are different here.
I was wondering if the control for shoddy workmanship or bad materials could be part of that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think really naming the materials that you feel are appropriate is a value add, while also recognizing that we want to encourage innovation in technology. right? We didn't have cement hardy board 30 years ago, and now it's kind of a pretty solid standard. So you want to build into your master plan that you're going to continue to allow for those adaptations. 3D printing is becoming increasingly popular in the Southwest. I don't think they've done one yet in the Midwest where we have freeze-thaw cycles a lot, but we'll get there.
Thank you.
Kelly, could you go back to the last slide that showed some financial incentives that Ryan had up there?
Then we need to
Yes, that's
wrap
the
up
one.
in the next couple minutes.
So my question, Ryan, many of the techniques that you presented, I've seen work beautifully in another place that I lived. But builders were incented by, I'm going to say, fairly long-term, 10 to 15-year tax abatements. No taxes would ever due for the first 15 years after you develop this property, and then they become due.
Yep.
Does that fall in any of these, or is that not an option in Michigan, or is that up to, it's beyond our purview, I know. City council could do that?
Yes. Yes. So all of these are time-based. Well, community land trust actually tends to be in perpetuity, but the top three are all time-based. And the city council can decide how long they want to grant that incentive for.
Okay.
So it could be as short as 4 or 5 years. It could be as long as 30 years. And it really depends on, the council will evaluate those tools against the public benefit that is being received as a result. The greater the public benefit, the longer the time horizon of the incentive.
It seems to me a really powerful incentive to a developer.
Yeah.
And it might take some of that to get what we want.
Yeah. Yeah, I would anticipate that a lot of projects, if it's more than a couple of units at a time, will require one of these tools to be used for at least a minimum 5 to 10 year period of time.
Yeah, it's been successful in other places that I'm familiar with, so.
Okay, where does that leave us?
Leaves us at about 6:50. And so we've got a 7 o'clock meeting. And if you
In terms of what else would you need from us at
Oh,
this point?
Yep, so, first of all, thank you, this is wonderful. And, I think that we will need to have some additional conversation about, incorporating some of this language into the master plan. So I guess I would give some homework, for each of you to consider, if these are, which of, we talked about a lot of different types of housing. If some or all or none of these are appealing to you, and I will, feel free to email me, but in the meantime, I will have a conversation, probably a wrap-up with Ryan and with Marcy, and we will talk about next steps.
Okay, very good.
Could we get the slides? Thank you.
Kelly's
Yes,
got it.
I have them, and I will include them with the minutes.
Perfect, thanks.
All right, very good. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
very well done.
Will those be posted for the public?
Yes. Okay, with that, I'm gonna call the workshop to adjournment, and we'll meet back in about 10 minutes, 7 o'clock for